Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this program, the first of 3 in Bennington Museum's Winter Virtual Series. I'm Dina Mallory, Director of Public Programs at Bennington Museum in beautiful Bennington, Vermont. Our galleries are closed until April 1st, so we take this opportunity to present some virtual programs on a variety of topics. On February 8th, Susan Bonser will talk about H.T. Cushman Furniture and the Cushman Manufacturing Company. On March 8th, Callie Raspusi will speak on the history of one of Bennington's most iconic landmarks, the Walloomsac Inn. Hope you'll be able to join us for those. For more information on those and our other programs and events, please visit us at benningtonmuseum.org. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Jessie Kraft, Resolute Americana Curator of American Numismatics, it's a mouthful, for the American Numismatic Society. He is an expert on monetary circulation in early America and oversees the American Numismatic Society's collection of coins, tokens, medals, and paper currency of both North and South America. Bennington Museum has a significant collection of Vermont copper coins dating to the 1780s, so we have invited Dr. Kraft to speak to us about their history and their place in the context of pre-federal money in the United States. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessie Kraft.
Thank you so much, Dina. Appreciate that kind introduction. While I get my screen shared, I want to thank everyone for joining us on this fine evening. If you haven't eaten dinner yet, here's an appetizer for you. If you have eaten dinner, here's some dessert. Either which way, we are all in for a treat because we're going to be talking about the history of Vermont coppers tonight from 1785 to 1788. As you mentioned, my name is Jessie Kraft. I'm the Resolute Americana Assistant Curator of American Numismatics at the American Numismatic Society in New York City. And tonight, of course, I'm going to be giving this presentation for the Bennington Museum in Bennington, Vermont. All the images that you see tonight with the black border are coins from the Bennington Museum collection. Those that don't have that border, and there are a few, not too many, don't have that border. So just so you can note the differences, and also there's a little bit of information about each image below. So I have some objectives tonight. First is to trace the history of Vermont copper coinage in the 1780s, to cover their production and circulation, to place them within the larger context of pre-federal money in the United States, and also to help you understand the hardships of monetary circulation in early Vermont and the early United States as a whole. But first, I asked kind of a basic question. What was Vermont in the 1780s? It all depended actually on who you asked. In January of 1777, Vermont actually declared its independence from both Great Britain and New York as the Republic of New Connecticut was its name in the 1780s, beginning in 1777. And prior to this, Vermont was always a part of New York. It was around the 1750s, late 1750s, into the 1760s, hostilities and border disputes started to open up. And by 1777, they wanted to break away from both New York and Great Britain. By June 2nd of that year, they changed their name to the state of Vermont. That's the state, meaning kind of country or republic, not necessarily the state as in the other 49 states as there now are. Colloquially, it was called the Republic of Vermont or the Republic of the Green Mountains, but it was never officially called that. It was officially the state of Vermont in the 1780s. However, throughout this time, New York and the United States did not recognize the independence of Vermont. They actually still considered a part of New York. However, this changed on March 4th, 1791, when it became the 14th state in the United States. And this coin to the right actually kind of speaks volumes about this situation. You can see the Latin motto, Quartodecima Stella, literally translates to the 14th star. So, and this coin was struck about 6 years before they became the 14th state. So as you can see, Vermont had all the ambition in the world back in 1785. So the other states, the 13 colonies turned states, they're actually in a different period, a different form of government than we now have. There is no constitution. There was no federal government. There was a small central government, but during this period, the national government was under the Confederation period. So it was a confederation of 13 states rather than 13 states under a federal government like we now have. This was the case from 1777 until 1789, when the Constitution was ratified. And I have two little quotes here, and this talks about the monetary circumstances of the Confederation period. So this is kind of how all the other states were operating monetarily at this time. So the Articles of Confederation stated that the United States in Congress assembled shall also have sole and exclusive right and power of regulating the alloy and value of coin struck by their own authority or by that of the respective states, provided that the legislative right of any state within its own limits be not infringed or violated. Then it goes on to say, the United States and Congress assembled shall never coin money, nor regulate the value thereof, nor emit bills, nor borrow money on the credit of the United States, unless 9 states assent to the same. So this basically outlined the monetary circumstances of the 1780s for the United States. And it basically says that any of the states can coin money as well as the central government, and neither of them can really say anything otherwise. So you have only a few states actually coin coins under this. You have Vermont, or I'm sorry, not Vermont, but Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, and New Hampshire also did, and Massachusetts, or New York a little bit. And then Vermont acting as kind of their own independent republic. So in 1785, a gentleman named Reuben Harmon Jr. actually receives a coining contract for the state of Vermont. He emigrated from Connecticut only a few years prior in 1768. He was a shopkeeper, but also held a variety of official positions. On June 15th, 1785, he received a 2-year contract initially to coin coppers to commence on July 1st of that year. So beginning July 1, 1785, he had 2 years to coin coppers for the states. The law stipulated that they were to weigh 1/3 of an ounce each, which is 160 grains, which is about 1.5 nickels in today's weight. So if you take 1.5 nickels or 5-cent pieces, that's about how much these coins weighed. They would contain designs and mottos approved by committee, and he was, Reuben Harmon was required to post a 5,000-pound surety bond, which he paid the following day. So this means that he actually had to give the state of Vermont 5,000 pounds in order to kind of be given this contract. And that was to ensure that he didn't kind of strike up a whole bunch of coppers and then flee town with all of them, because the amount of coppers that he would have struck for the state of Vermont would have been less than 5,000 pounds. So had he done that, he actually would have been, taking money from himself, essentially. So design influences. Here on the left, we have one of the original designs for the state of Vermont coinage. You can see the sun rising over the Green Mountains. If you're looking east from Rupert and Bennington as well, you can see the motto. It says Vermont's Res Publica, which translates actually to the state of Green Mountainers, and then a date and a plow. On the reverse, you see the all-seeing eye with rays and 13 stars with that motto again, the Quartodecima Stella. On the right, however, you see a different coin that was minted in 1783. This is known as the Nova Constellatio copper. They were minted in 1783 and 1785, and there's also actually 1786 dated pieces, but those are now considered counterfeits that circulated. So there's only really 2 dates, official dates, that are struck. They're struck in England specifically for use in America, and they circulated heavily in and around New York and along the eastern seaboard in the 1780s. So this is where the reverse in particular, obviously, is where the original design for the Vermont copper came from. So early problems with the minting process. Harmon owned land for mint. He owned copper. He acquired a press. However, he couldn't engrave dies. So the dies are the things that actually strike the coins. He wasn't a die engraver. It takes a separate skill to be able to do that, to engrave intricate designs into steel. And he couldn't do that. So he actually subcontracted out this process to two individuals, Daniel Van Voorhis and William Coley, both of New York City, silversmiths or goldsmiths in New York City. Coley, the latter person, actually ended up moving to Vermont later on to work at Harmon's Mint. But there were the people who essentially allowed this operation to continue from the get-go, because without dies, you can't coin any coins. So to the right here, you actually see some of the hallmarks that were used by Daniel Van Voorhis and William Coley. And then on the bottom, the V and C is a joint venture that they had. So they were able, by this point, to start striking coppers, and everything seemed to be going all right. But by October of that year, they actually realized that their coins were too good. They're too good. They're too heavy. There's too much copper in them. So they actually had to reduce the weight. There was probably problems with circulating the coins because of that, interestingly enough. If you had one of these coins and another coin, a person who was holding a lighter coin would probably spend that, and the lighter coins are actually circulating better than the heavier coins, believe it or not. So they actually reduced the weight to 111 grains down from 160 grains. And this was the new weight as they circulated from this point forward. We actually have a nice kind of secondhand description of the Mint House, as an elderly gentleman from Rupert described it in a letter from 1855. So this is many, many decades after the fact, but he did have recollections of the mint. So here's a little quote from him. It said, "His mint house was located near the northeast corner of Rupert, a little east of the main road leading from Dorset to Paulet, on a small stream of water called Millbrook, which empties into the Paulet River. It was a small building about 16 by 18 feet, made of rough materials, sided with unplaned and unpainted boards." So it sounds like it was a little, a very small shack, essentially, something that you probably wouldn't want to use today for coining operations because of security purposes, but they got away with it. So how were these coins struck? This is also kind of interesting. We do have another actually secondhand recollection from a different individual, also from 1855, who gave his recollections, quote, "The stamping was done by means of an iron screw attached to heavy timbers above and moved by hand through the aid of ropes. 60 per minute could be stamped, although 30 per minute was the usual number. 3 persons were required for the purpose, 1 to place the copper and 2 to swing the stamp." So this actually says a lot. First off, in 1785, they could actually strike 1 coin per second, which is amazing when you think about it, with the relatively primitive machinery that they had. It was literally a giant screw going through a piece of wood, and they can strike 60 coins per minute with that. But that was the high end, so they struck about 1 coin every 2 seconds. On the other hand, you have, it actually states how many people operated. So on the right here, we have 2 images. One is a screw press being operated by 2 people, 1 person swinging the arm. And on the bottom, we have a screw press where 4 people are swinging the arm. However, our description says that there are 2 people. So imagine something in between these 2 sizes, something fairly large, but not too big, where you needed 4 people to swing the giant arm. So that's how these were struck. A nice little tidbit of information that we can add to the history of Vermont coppers. So Rupert Harmon got his act together. He got coins going. The dies were made. The coins are being struck. He lowered the weights. Everything seems to be running smoothly now. He actually wants to extend the contract, a quote-unquote 10-year extension. This was approved the following day, so October 24th, he was granted which actually turned out to be an 8-year extension because they added the 2 years that he was already granted. So his quote-unquote 10-year extension is actually what we consider an 8-year extension, beginning on July 1st of 1787, which was the day that his initial contract was to expire. The new agreement allowed him to strike coins duty-free, so he didn't have to pay anything to strike the coins, to recover the cost of creating the mint and purchasing equipment, and so on and so forth. After this, he was actually required to pay 2.5% of the coppers he struck. So again, kind of this means of almost dissuading people to want to make money and go through this process. By 1786, we actually have a major change in design. We no longer have the sun rising over the green mountains and the all-seeing eye on the reverse. We have what looks to be a male bust right on the obverse, and then a seated Columbia, or what later becomes seated Liberty, on the reverse. These are the two main styles of Vermont coppers. There are kind of sub-varieties and stuff like that going on with them, but kind of these are the two main ones that you'll see, the landscape and the portrait. And the landscape was struck in 1785 and 86, then the portrait was struck from 86 through 1788. It wasn't that the first design was not liked or considered quote unquote ugly or anything like that. In fact, we have a newspaper account from 1787 that says, quote, "The coinage is well executed and the device is sentimental, ingenious, and beautiful." So it was actually well received in the 1780s. However, the transition occurred right at or just prior to this 8-year extension. And the extension actually says that, quote, "The device for all coppers by him," meaning Rupert or Reuben, "hereafter coin shall be on the one side a head with the motto Auctoritate Vermontissimium abridged, and on the reverse a woman with the lettering Indi et Lib for Independence et Liberty." That's exactly what we have on the right hand coin. This variety in particular is called the baby head. It looks like a young child's head as opposed to a more adult head. So they're, again, within these sub-varieties. This one in particular is called the baby head. And most baby head varieties are in poor quality. So this is actually a very nice and high-grade coin, despite some kind of planchet flaws that are happening on it. So it was often suggested that this change was to resemble British halfpence that were in circulation at the time. However, at this point, a good percentage, most of the British halfpence in circulation were actually counterfeit, and people were beginning to reject them at this point. So that doesn't make much sense that you would want to change the design of a well-received coin to something that was in the early stages of being rejected. Numismatist Roy Bonjour put forth the theory that it wasn't British halfpennies that they wanted to resemble, but Connecticut coinage, copper coins that were being struck. And this is more of a fair assessment. As you can see here, the coin on the left is from Vermont. The coin on the right is from Connecticut. They both have male bust right. One says Vermont Auctory, meaning by the authority of Vermont. The other says Auctory, Connecticut, by the authority of Connecticut. Indi et Lib and Indi et Lib. So it's a very almost one-to-one, with the exception of the state, of course. However, there's no real reason given why the state of Vermont decided to begin to mimic those of Connecticut. And really, despite this drastic change, the earliest coins are punch linked to William Coley. So before this, there's the Bonjour. All right, so Abel Buell, who I was just about to get to on the previous slide, was a Connecticut die engraver who was having in the process of creating all the Connecticut dies, and it is believed that this change in design for the Vermont coppers possibly happened because of Abel Buell. So if you recall, Van Voorhees and Coley, these were the individuals from New York City who were partners with Reuben Harmon. They actually they didn't quite go behind Reuben Harmon's back, but without his knowledge per se, they actually went to the New York legislature to try and petition to them if they can strike coppers for them as well, for the state of New York. It was thought that Harmon in Vermont knew of this. He found out about it, and believing that he would lose the talents of Van Voorhees and Coley, that he sought Abel Buell to come in instead. So that's one possible reason on why this kind of mimicry between the Vermont and Connecticut coppers existed. However, there's another kind of story, again from 1855, from this hearsay evidence, who kind of creates this really, really interesting story. And it's actually quite plausible, too. So this is actually told by Abel Buell Moore, who is Abel Buell's grandson, right? So apparently in late 1786, Buell's son, William, who is Abel Buell Moore's relative as well, he had obtained nitric acid, which was a common chemical in the minting process from a local drugstore. Apparently on the way home, he was stopped by some Native Americans. They assumed that it contained rum, and they drank it and died. William was accused of their death, so he actually fled to Rupert, Vermont, taking some of the quote-unquote original dyes used by his father at New Haven, which is where Abel Buell was operating at the time. Buell, there is some connection between in the Buell family between Connecticut and Rupert, in that Buell's daughter from their first marriage actually lived in East Rupert. So it's plausible that he, went to go see his, kind of fled town and went to his half-sister in Rupert. While there is actually no actual evidence of William Buell working for the mint, there's no question that he was there and that he actually knew Reuben Harmon, actually, because he surveyed land for him. So there's no doubt that there's a connection, but there's no evidence that there's actual connection in the minting operations. Just hearsay. So, quote unquote, lightweight Vermont coppers, and I use these lightweight in quotes on purpose. So on April 20th, 1787, the New York legislature, not Vermont, but New York, enacted a law stating that on October 1st of that year, on August 1st of that year, any coin that weighed under 145.8 grains would no longer be accepted in circulation. This actually would have included all of the Vermont coppers, because remember that they were 160, but they were lowered to 111 grains. So they actually fell within this as well. Also included counterfeit halfpence, the Nova Constellatio coppers that we discussed earlier. All of these were essentially deemed illegal under New York state law. So Harmon and other people, they actually purchased as many of these coppers as they could and used them as blanks, essentially, or planchets for their coins. So you can see this coin here on the right actually used a Nova Constellatio copper as a blank under it, and you can see the eye, the all-seeing eye, that the reverse of the original Vermont coppers mimicked through the head of the bust on the obverse. And on the reverse, you can see other design elements as too, but that eye really pops through. It's really, really cool. So there's a merger by Reuben Harmon. In June of 1787, both to increase production and die making, the partnership was expanded. So you had Harmon, Coley, and Van Voorhees, who was the original three, but then there's another person named Elias Jackson. So there's four. But then they brought in this whole other group of people from Newburgh, New York, who is Thomas Machen, James and Samuel Atlee, and then other people who, I don't mean to disrespect them, but they're not necessarily big players in this. So Machen and the Atlees are the real players in this. The others were more financial backers. So now you have two places that are striking Vermont coppers, one of them in Vermont, in Rupert, and then another place in Newburgh, New York, which is not quite halfway between New York City and Albany, but somewhere around there, right along the Hudson. So this situation not only helped Rupert Harmon and all them expand their production, but it also helped Thomas Machen, as he owned a mint. He owned or had hired die makers. He had the financial and legal backing, but he did not have a coining contract like they did in Vermont. So he kind of wanted to latch on because he had all the machinery and everything in the world, but couldn't legally necessarily strike coins for any specific place. Machen actually gave them 600 pounds up front, as well as 40% of all their profits. So they were quite anxious to get in. From these proceeds, a new mint in Rupert was constructed, and again, from this point forward, they were being made in two different places. The coins to the right are interesting. The one on the top are coins that, because Machen's Mills did not have a coining contract, this is what they struck, the coin on the top right, which is a counterfeit British halfpenny. On the obverse, you can see George III, and it says George III Rex, which means King George III, and on the reverse, it says Britannia. They're literally striking counterfeit British halfpennies. Once they got the merger with the Vermont contract, you actually have some really, really interesting kind of illegal combinations appearing. The coin in the middle, you can see Vermont Octory. Unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult to read, but the reverse die in the coin in the middle is the exact same die as the one above it. So we know that it says Britannia. So it's kind of this, what's known as a mule, where you mix two dies that weren't ever supposed to be together. This is a mule between a Vermont copper and a counterfeit British halfpenny. On the bottom, you can see kind of the opposite, where you have George III on the obverse, but then on the reverse, it says Indi et lib. And this would have been one of the reverses used on a Vermont copper. So you have these really, really interesting mules of counterfeit halfpence and British coppers. So the end of Vermont coppers, every good thing must come to an end, and that is the case with Vermont coppers as well. So according to tradition, by 1789, the Rupert Mint closed due to the copper panic. Now, the copper panic dealt directly with all of those counterfeit British halfpennies that were in circulation. By 1789, people were sick of them. They absolutely refused to take them, and all copper coins in circulation were reduced in value down to 25% of their former value. So it didn't quite become worthless, but it became much worth less than it was before. So it was originally thought that this was the end of the Rupert Mint, but that doesn't seem to be the case now, because if you look at the coins numismatically, at the physical objects, it doesn't seem like the coins that were being struck early on are the same that were being struck towards the end of this period. It seems like the first coins were struck at Rupert. There is potentially a little bit of overlap between the Rupert and the Newburgh Mint and Machen's Mills. But then for most of the coins of 1788, if not all of them, it's probable that they're actually struck in New York, and that by maybe mid 1787, the Rupert Mint was actually closed. But there's no records that stay one way or another, so we'll never really actually be sure. However, either which way, no matter when it actually closed, all the machinery was eventually shipped to Machen's Mills in Newburgh, and they bought a lot of the devalued coppers that were being taken out of circulation and struck more Vermont coppers with them. And this, what you can see here on the right in particular, most of them are struck over counterfeit Irish halfpence, not British, but Irish. And this one is one of those. On the reverse, you can see all the way at the top an RNIA, and this is actually the last four letters of the word Hibernia, which is Latin for Ireland. So this is one of those counterfeit Irish halfpennies that Machen's Mills purchased and then used to strike more Vermont coppers. And actually on the obverse, you can see where it says Vermont, so you can see some of EORG, which is part of George III's name. So really, really interesting piece. So I mentioned counterfeits. These coins were actually counterfeited as well. These are known as contemporary counterfeits, meaning that they were struck contemporaneous to the time that they circulated. These were meant to fool the local grocer or the person down the street or anyone that you owed money. This was not meant to fool modern numismatists. These are not, counterfeit coins that you'll, that are easily that will fool coin collectors or anything like that. They're easily differentiated from the original pieces. Most of them they could either come struck or cast, and they're all extremely collectible today. If you can show that one of these counterfeits actually circulated at the time when they were supposed to circulate, they're extremely, extremely important pieces. This piece on the left is one of those contemporary counterfeits, and I place it next to a genuine piece on the right just so you can see the differences. Some major differences are that the date is raised up on the counterfeit. It's no longer on the lower portion. There's a kind of a line, which is known as an exurge above the date. The mountains are clearly different, even possibly facing the opposite direction. So really, really interesting piece that we know for sure circulated during the period. And these are extremely rare. So this piece in particular is probably more rare than any other coin that I showed you. And if you have one of these, you have a really special coin. So what else was in circulation? There was paper currency. Vermont actually printed its own paper currency in 1781. It was authorized in a whole array of denominations from 1 shilling up to 3 pounds. At the time, 3 pounds was equivalent to $10, 10 Spanish dollars. So if you have a 3 pounds note, you had a $10 bill, essentially. You can read here that the possessor of this bill shall be paid by the treasurer of the state of Vermont. I'm reading the middle one, 5 shillings in silver at 6 shillings and 8 pence per ounce by the first day of June, AD 1782. So again, these were authorized in February of 1781, and they were to be redeemed by June of 1782. So this was meant to be a short-term circulating note, only in circulation for about a year and 3 months, and then they were to be redeemed, and you would be able to redeem these in for silver. These notes are extremely rare. You can see some of them, these look like rags at this point. They're not in great condition. At the same time, these are highly, highly prized. If you had a quarter of one of these notes, you have something special. I think the Bennington Museum has 4 1781 notes, if I'm not mistaken. So that's an amazing collection, believe it or not, of just having 4 in relatively intact condition, even though one of them is missing, a fifth of it or whatever it is. It's still amazing pieces. I didn't mention silver or gold at all. I did mention silver in the last slide when I was talking about the paper currency, that they could be redeemed in silver. However, the state of Vermont didn't strike any silver. So what is the silver that could be redeemed? This is actually all foreign silver and gold coinage. The main silver coins that were in circulation at the time were Spanish American. They were either struck mostly in Mexico City or Peru. And they came up into North America by trade through the West Indies. They would be traded in West Indies, and then North American traders would go and take stuff down to the West Indies, Cuba, Jamaica, and so on and so forth, and then receive those coins for the stuff that they brought down. And that was the main circulating medium of silver and gold for several hundred years in this country, well into the modern republic era. In 1857 is really kind of the definitive date of when they ended circulation. But you have kind of 4 main players in the circulation of foreign coinage. Spanish American, again, small pieces, half real, 1 real, 2 reals. 2 real piece is the same as a quarter. So you have a quarter, an eighth, a dollar, or a 16th of a dollar is what those denominations would be. You actually had Brazilian gold, which was in the denomination of 6,400 reis, which was the value of $8. And that's what you see down here. You have British silver gold, French, mostly 5 francs, which were about the size of a dollar, a little bit smaller than a dollar, and some gold. And then others. You even had German coins, Danish, Dutch. You had even Arabic coins for gold coins and silver coins. Some of these, most of the coins, you can't tell what actually circulated, with exception. In fact, this piece on the bottom right is one of these Brazilian 6,400 reis coins. In the North America, they're actually known as Joes because of the name of the Portuguese monarch, Josephus. They just take the first three letters and you have Joe, Joe or Joes. So this was known as a Joe or a half Joe, depending on the exact denomination. But this piece in particular, without question, was in both New York and Boston. And I know this for a fact because of the two little marks, one's on the obverse and one's on the reverse, that were put there by goldsmiths that were operating in those two cities at the time. Right around the neck on Joe's neck on the obverse, you can see an EB. That's the hallmark for Ephraim Brasher, who is operating out of New York. And then on the reverse in the middle, but it's upside down, is a TP. And that stood for Thomas Pons, who is a silversmith out of Boston. So this coin, without question, despite being struck in Brazil, without fail, without question, circulated in both New York and Boston. So it's a really, really special coin. So collecting Vermont coppers. Hopefully by this time I've enticed you to want to collect these really, really interesting pieces. There's only 40 die varieties in total. Some of them are extremely rare. And when you can find them, they're not in pretty condition. You can barely tell what they are, but they're priceless artifacts of this period. That being said, despite there only being 40 coins to have a quote unquote complete collection of these, so again, some of them are rare and it's not an easy venture. So have fun doing it, but don't expect to do it overnight. I have a little saying here under the 40 die varieties. On average, there are poor dies and poor planchets mixed with heavy circulation. So this has caused high quality coins to be very hard to locate. And, it kind of reiterates what I just said. Many, many books have been written on Vermont coppers, books or important articles from the 1870s up to the present. Two big ones that I'm going to mention is the 1919 Hilliard Ryder and the 1947 John M. Richardson. Ryder kind of quote unquote wrote the book on Vermont coppers, and then Richardson followed that up and expanded on it with things that have been discovered since that original 1919 article. Most of the time when you see a Vermont copper that's up for auction, you'll see a little number that's usually an RR number, and that'll go up to 40. And that correlates directly with the die varieties. And the RR stands for Ryder Richardson. So they correlate with the John Richardson article that kind of delineates all the different sub varieties and varieties that I was talking about earlier on. However, all these books are very specialized. So if you want to buy one book in particular, I would actually suggest the book that's pictured to the right, and that's not in the list. This is by Q. David Bowers, and it's the Colonial and Early American Coinage, the Encyclopedia of Colonial and Early American Coins. This is just in its second edition that was published, I think, in 2020. This includes not only Vermont coppers, but all coppers that were struck in the pre-federal period, so anything before 1791, essentially. But it goes into very good detail, even though it's kind of all-encompassing of the colonial period. It does still list all those 40 die varieties, plus all the coins that all the other states and colonies before that were striking. So if I were to suggest one book, I would suggest the Whitman Encyclopedia of Colonial and Early American Coins, if you want to be an active collector of Vermont and colonial coins. So the Vermont coppers in the Bennington Museum in particular, they were all a gift of Mr. Hall Park McCullough, who lived from 1872 to 1966. He was the son and grandson of two Vermont governors. Today, in fact, the governor's mansion is named the Park McCullough Historic Governor's Mansion. So two of his three names are in the name of the historic governor's mansion. He founded Bennington College. He served on many, many boards in Bennington. Kind of numismatically, he was the president of the First National Bank of Bennington, North Bennington, for 47 years, and on its board for 75 years. So quite a long and active life he lived. So thank you. That's all I got, essentially. I hope that you learned a little bit about Vermont coppers and Vermont and early American money. I have my email listed here. If you come across any questions I can't think of now, but want to ask me in the future, you're more than welcome to take note of my email. Or if you have a question now, you can add them to the Q&A. I'll be happy to take them. So thank you again, and any questions?
Thank you so much, Jesse. There are a few questions that have been added to the Q&A. So I'll share those with you. This one goes back kind of to the beginning of your presentation, and it was asking about a photo on the mint location slide. I'm not sure if that makes sense to you. It was, what was the photo on the mint location slide?
Mint location slide. Possibly this one. This is kind of a random image. It's not of the Mint House in particular. The Mint House actually, we do know when it ended up blowing down in a snowstorm in 1856, the winter 1855, 1856. In one of these letters from 1855, the individual says that the building was still standing, and he actually writes back in 1856 saying that the building blew down over the past winter. So we know when the building actually demised, and it was moved from its location by that point, and was being used not as a coin house, but as a corn house. It was used to hold corn by that point. But this image, I'm a little embarrassed to say, is an image that I found on Google when I Googled Rupert, Vermont, and and just wanted to show that is not a big city. This is kind of downtown Rupert, and it's not a very big city, but it has a very, very special history to Vermont and the United States, as one of the very, very few places that struck coins during this brief period in American history. So despite being a very small place, it holds dear to many numismatists. So I think that's the slide that was in question. So I hope I answered the question.
I think so. I think that's sort of the classic Vermont metropolis right there, isn't it? Franklin asks if Harmon received legislative permission to reduce the weight of the coins, or did he just do it?
Yes, yeah. That was legislatively. So that, I think, was October of 1785 I had written down. That was the legislative date. That was when he did it on his own. So yeah, good question.
Okay. Sarah's been trying to work out the Latin translation of quarta decima. And she was thinking it must be 4 plus 10.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you read transcriptions of like 16th, 17th century material, you kind of get used to that, where they like 24 will be 4 and 20, and it doesn't make much sense at first, but you got to get used to that. So that's exactly what it is 4 plus 10.
Great, thank you. Any evidence? See, any evidence for the coppers circulating in Vermont from account books, etc.?
They definitely circulated, and they circulated heavily. This is the problem with account books, is that very, very, very few people during this period mentioned specifically what type of money they were getting. Regardless, 99% of the time, regardless of what kind of money they're getting, they would essentially convert it into pounds and shillings, and then just use that. So when they're getting Joes and half Joes and Mexican dollars and all those things, 9 times out of 10, they're converting it into pounds and shillings, and then just speaking in those terms. So we know numismatically that they're circulating. Almost all the coins are very, very heavily worn. So there's no doubt that they were passing from hand to hand for quite a long time. But finding the written evidence of that is a little bit more difficult, and even little brief mentions of stuff like that are treasure troves to numismatists. So if you do find anything, please let me know. And yeah.
So Amy asks an interesting question. How did the coins get from the mint into popular circulation?
Yeah, that is a good question. A lot of these times, and I know there's a lot of good records on how they did this in New York from these New York places. And I'm assuming that they did it the same way because a lot of these people are actually the same people. They're very interrelated kind of groups happening and commingling. So they're oftentimes there would be one person who would kind of be the person to release these into circulation, and they would literally go from town to town and try to buy things and try to enter them in circulation. People didn't necessarily have to take these. A lot of the times, when these new coins struck, they didn't even know what they were, or they knew that they were trying to imitate a coin that came before it, but they didn't know exactly how much it weighed, or stuff like that. So there's a lot to consider when trying to introduce new coins into circulation. And the really one of the few ways to do it was literally just go out and try to buy things with them, and hoped that people accepted them. And that was the tried and true way of doing it. With paper currency, one of the best ways that they did that, and most prolific ways, that they would actually give money to the military, and they have the military buy things with it, and that would just disseminate the money really throughout the state and colonies before that and stuff like that. So it really is just kind of make the money and cross your fingers and hope people accept it.
Which Franklin asks, which RR variety is the most difficult to locate?
I want to say it's RR34 or something like that. There's a couple. There's 3 or 4 that are really, really difficult. Where there might be a dozen known, or even fewer than that. Generally speaking, when you have these kind of numbers, or like books that deal with that, varieties of coins, generally the higher the number, not always, but generally the higher the number, when it's kind of these older books anyway, the higher the number, the rarer they are, because usually the person that wrote the book started with 1, and that's going to be the most common variety because that's the first one they found. So the higher the number, generally the rarer, but that's not always the case, and especially not the case today because people don't necessarily number the coins chronologically of how they found them. So,
sure, that makes sense. And Sarah wants to put in a plug for the Vermont Coppers collection at our good friends, the Vermont Historical Society. And many of the coppers in their collection were given by Sanborn Partridge from Proctor. So check out their collection as well. Excellent. And I'll just mention, that many museums, ours included, and certainly the Vermont Historical Society, their collections are searchable online via their websites. So, if you're interested in seeing the Historical Society's collection or the Bennington Museum's collection, you can usually access those from our website. I think actually, Jesse, you probably accessed those images yourself from our website.
Yes, I did. Yeah, no, it was very easy to use, and lovely website.
Great. Are there any other questions anyone would like to add? I was fascinated by the amount of counterfeiting that was going on. I guess I shouldn't be surprised knowing what I do about early Vermont and New England in general. But yeah, that was interesting to me.
Yeah, and it really is kind of this upper Hudson Valley, which includes, southwestern Vermont, that was a really, really hotbed for counterfeiting activity. And then eventually, once the Articles of Confederation, those counterfeiters tried to become legitimate, stuff like that, but some did, some didn't. But yeah, it really is an interesting location.
Are the Richardson and Ryder reference book, are they books or articles? And if articles, where are they published?
They are, well, the Ryder piece was an article. It was originally published in 1919 in the American Journal of Numismatics, which was published by the ANS. We published that. The following year, it was published as a book, along with 2 other books that focused on Connecticut and Massachusetts coppers. So it was published as kind of a book with 2 other books, kind of, bound volume. That really just republished what was published the year prior in the AJN. The Richardson book is also, is not a book, is an article as well. Trying to think of where that was published. I'm not sure. I apologize. Maybe the Numismatist, something that doesn't seem like that's right. I apologize, but it's an article as well. But if you get that, the Whitman Encyclopedia, that includes all of the RR numbers and you won't have to search for obsolete material. So,
and we can probably use our Google foo if we're really curious.
Yeah. And, a plug for the Newman Numismatic Portal. It's an amazing online platform. I wouldn't be surprised if both of those articles are digitally available on that. So, they're probably out there.
Great. Well, thank you again, Jesse. I really appreciate you taking the time to pull together this presentation for us and to share it with us. Thanks so much, and everyone have an enjoyable evening. Take care.
Thank you, Dina. Take care.